So good morning. My name is Monica Carlsen. I'm a Peterborough postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Botany, working with John Kress, and I started in the museum in February this year. I just want to first thank the Center of Science for the invitation to present my research here, as well as my research collaborators and other funding sponsors. So the main focus of my research is to understand the evolution of diversity, in particular in tropical plants, and those that are distributed in the American continent or the Neotropics, where about 60% of the plant diversity lies. My study system is the genus Anthurium, which is probably very familiar to most of you as an ornamental plant in a house. But in this case, this is only one species, and all the variation that you see here is the product of man-made hybrids for horticultural purposes. In reality, the genus comprises about 1,000 species, exclusively distributed in the Neotropics from southern Mexico to Central America, the Caribbean, all the way down to South America. And as you can see for these pictures, there is an immense variation in morphology, both in leaf, flowers, and fruits. Despite this diversity, and also the potential for horticultural purposes, there are still a lot of ecological and evolutionary questions that remain to be answered in the group. For example, how old is Anthurium? Most people suggest that for groups that are highly diverse and very widespread, they should be old, just because it takes a lot of time to create new species and for those species to migrate all over the Neotropics, for example. So what is the age of diversification of most of the current species that we see in Anthurium? Another question that I also had is how these thousands of species arose. In theory, changes in climate will be associated with changes in morphology and therefore promote speciation. So for most groups, in a continuous space between climate and morphology, like the one depicted here, they should fall at the intersection of different climates with different morphologies in the top right-hand corner of the graph. So is this really happening in Anthurium or not? In order to answer these questions, my research draws a lot of lines of evidence together, but most of them are based on the use of collections in museums and research greenhouse collections, once more showcasing the long-lasting importance of museums like the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History. So the evidence to reject the first hypothesis that Anthurium is an old group comes from time calibration with fossil data of the evolutionary tree that you can see here on your left. From the time scale at the bottom, you can see that the major diversification event in Anthurium occurred about 5 to 8 million years ago, something very recent in geological terms. We can also see from this tree that there are several groups of Anthurium, and they are indeed very different from each other. For example, the groups that are showcased here with big purple triangles is because they are really widespread, and most of the species occur in the lowland forest and Amazonian basin. The groups that have smaller triangles, they all have very restricted distributions, and in fact comprise the majority of the species of Anthurium, about 76% of them. And they occur either in Andean cloud forests, the blue triangles, or in other forest types in the yellow triangles. So from these two evidence, we can actually know that Anthurium is indeed a very young clade. And even though the genus itself is very widespread, most of the groups of species are indeed extremely restricted in their geographic distributions. On the other side, if we plot these groups in our morphological climate continuum, we see that they divide the space very, very nicely. So we have the Andean groups, for example, where the species that belong to these groups, they tend to inhabit different climatic conditions, but their morphology, on the other hand, is very similar. For the species that are distributed in more widespread in the lowland forests on the Amazon basin, they all share the same broad climatic conditions, and their morphology is also very similar. On the other hand, groups of Anthuriums that are distributed in other forest types, their climates are very similar, but their morphology is different. The most striking thing, though, is that in the top right-hand corner, there are no groups of Anthuriums. So our original hypothesis that climate and morphology goes hand in hand and promotes diversification is also rejected for Anthurium. So what have we learned about Anthurium and neotropical diversification of plants? First of all, that it doesn't seem to follow any of the rules that we thought. But how general is this? We don't know yet, but we're working on it by including more groups in the arum family and also in the ginger family, as well as comparison with Asian tropical forests. What we do know is that location matters. Most of the correlations that we have found in the groups of closely related species are location dependent. Where you are tells you a lot more about the species, tells you the size of their geographic ranges, their climatic preferences, and also their morphological diversity. And with that, I would like to open the room for questions.
Monica, over time, ranges expand and they contract, and your conclusion was that these species were young because they were in isolated, small, endemic areas. What is the relationship between the age of the species and the age of the genus itself, and how would you determine that?
So, in fact, can you hear me? Yeah. So the genus itself is very old. It's about 80 to 90 million years old, and I actually showed that in the slide, and I was happy that somebody picked it up. But what happened, though, and what we believe it happened, and we have some empirical results showing that extinction rates in the genus throughout time has been very, very high. So probably it was already widespread about 80 million years ago, but changes in climate throughout the neotropics, which we know were really high desertification and arid climates in the Miocene, probably contribute to an extinction of most of those old species. And the current diversity that we see now is what is very young. So there is this gap in between the age of the genus, and probably was already widespread back then because we can find fossils all the way in Central America and South America. But it got wiped out probably during the Miocene drying of the area. And then after, or during the uplift of the Andes, new niches, warmer niches with more precipitation arose, developed, and that's when Anthurium started to flourish again. But yeah, my results are all based on the current species diversification, and that is very, very young. Probably 10 or 20 million years down the road, all those species will be able to colonize a bigger area in the neotropics, but so far they haven't.
Okay, thank you very much.